They said this place did not exist until the buses arrived at dawn. The sun had not yet climbed over the volcanic hills of Tekaluka when the iron gates opened, and the world witnessed something it had never seen before. Row after row of men, shackled at the ankles and wrists, heads shaved, eyes hollow yet defiant, were marched into a concrete fortress so massive it looked less like a prison and more like a modern citadel built for war. This was CECOT, the Terrorism Confinement Center, the most heavily guarded prison ever constructed in the Western Hemisphere. What followed was not just the story of a prison, but the story of fear, power, violence, redemption denied, and a global debate that still echoes from Central America to the streets of the United States. CECOT was born from chaos. For decades, El Salvador had been trapped in a nightmare that many Americans only knew through brief headlines or crime documentaries. Gangs, MS-13 and Barrio 18, ruled neighborhoods like parallel governments. They collected taxes, enforced curfews, recruited children, and executed those who resisted. Murder rates soared so high that some years El Salvador became the most violent country on earth not officially at war. In Los Angeles, U.S. law enforcement knew these names well. MS-13 had grown in the shadows of American cities, formed by displaced Salvadoran youth fleeing civil war in the 1980s. Deportations sent hardened gang members back to a fragile El Salvador, where weak institutions allowed them to flourish. Over time, the gangs evolved into transnational criminal organizations, dealing drugs, trafficking humans, laundering money, and exporting terror. By the early 2020s, the Salvadoran state was losing control. Then came the turning point. In a single weekend, dozens of civilians were slaughtered. The killings were coordinated, brutal, and symbolic, a message from the gangs to the government. We still own the streets. The response was unprecedented. A state of exception was declared. Constitutional protections were suspended. Arrests followed at a scale unseen in modern Latin American history. And the government faced a question no nation wants to answer. Where do you put tens of thousands of the world's most dangerous criminals? The answer rose from the earth itself. CECOT was constructed in secrecy, deep in rural El Salvador, far from cities, far from escape routes, surrounded by military zones and natural barriers. Satellite images later revealed its terrifying scale. Multiple layers of walls, watchtowers armed with snipers, motion sensors, electrified fences, and a capacity designed for 40,000 inmates. This was not a prison designed for rehabilitation. This was a prison designed for containment. Each cell block was built to erase individuality. Inmates would not have names, only numbers. Cells held dozens of men packed together under constant surveillance. No outdoor recreation, no visits, no phone calls, no education programs, no television, no books, no mirrors. Lights stayed on 24 hours a day. The official explanation was simple. These men had used freedom as a weapon. Freedom would never be returned to them. The first mass transfer to CECOT shocked the world. Videos released by the government showed thousands of inmates moved with military precision. Guards in riot gear, prisoners forced to kneel, heads pushed down. Tattoos, once symbols of fear, now marks of permanent captivity. For many Americans watching online, it looked unreal. Some called it justice, others called it authoritarianism. Human rights organizations condemned it, crime victims applauded it. But behind those walls, history was being rewritten. One of the first men processed into CECOT was known on the streets as El Diablo de Soyapango. In U.S. gang databases, he was linked to murders in California, extortion networks across Central America, and human trafficking routes into Texas and Arizona. He had escaped prison twice before. He had ordered executions by phone while incarcerated. At CECOT, he became inmate 28177. No one used his nickname again. When he entered his cell block, he understood something immediately. This place did not fear him. The architecture itself was a psychological weapon. There were no blind spots, no shadows to hide in. Every movement was tracked, every breath accounted for. CECOT was designed not only to imprison bodies, but to break criminal hierarchies. Gang leaders were deliberately mixed with rival factions. Communication was restricted to silence or whispers that carried consequences. Any sign of organization was crushed instantly. Guards were rotated constantly to prevent corruption. Even the prison staff were isolated from the outside world for extended shifts. This was a system built on one radical idea: total control. The impact outside the walls was immediate. Homicide rates collapsed. Extortion calls stopped. Neighborhoods once ruled by fear saw children playing outside again. Businesses reopened. For the first time in generations, many Salvadorans felt safe walking at night. International journalists arrived, expecting propaganda. Instead, they found empty crime scenes. For Americans, especially those living in cities plagued by gang violence, the question became uncomfortable. Could this ever happen in the United States? U.S. prisons already held some of the world's most dangerous criminals: ADX Florence, Guantanamo Bay detainees, Supermax facilities. But even those places allowed limited communication, legal challenges, structured routines. CECOT offered none of that. It existed outside traditional models. Inside, time lost meaning. Inmates slept on steel bunks without mattresses. Meals were minimal: beans, rice, tortillas. Medical care existed only to prevent death, not comfort. The silence was broken only by orders, alarms, or screams. There were no riots. Fear replaced rebellion. Former gang enforcers, men who once ruled neighborhoods, now flinched at footsteps. Tattoos that once commanded respect became liabilities. The symbols that defined their identity now ensured permanent suspicion. Some inmates attempted hunger strikes. They failed. Others prayed. Many simply stared into nothingness, day after endless day. CECOT was not interested in confessions, apologies, or reform. It was interested in removal. Critics warned of a dangerous precedent. Human rights groups argued that mass incarceration without due process risked imprisoning innocents. Families protested outside government buildings, claiming their sons were taken simply for living in the wrong neighborhood or having the wrong tattoo. The government responded with cold numbers: weapons seized, murders prevented, lives saved. For victims of gang violence, mothers who buried children, shop owners who paid extortion for decades, CECOT was not cruelty, it was closure. The moral line blurred. American policymakers quietly took notes. Law enforcement agencies studied the model, not to replicate it, but to understand its effectiveness. Think tanks debated whether extreme incarceration deterred crime or merely delayed it. Media outlets framed CECOT as either a miracle or a warning. But no one denied its results. The gangs that once terrorized El Salvador were shattered. Not reformed, shattered. Years passed, and CECOT remained sealed from the world. No escapes, no uprisings, no reversals. The men inside aged under artificial light, their legends fading into numbers. Outside, a generation grew up without knowing nightly gunfire as normal. And yet, the question lingered like a shadow across borders. What is justice when fear ends but freedom disappears? CECOT did not answer that question. It simply stood there, silent, massive, immovable, an iron monument to a moment in history when a nation decided that safety would come at any cost. For the United States, watching from afar, CECOT became more than a prison. It became a mirror, reflecting fears about crime, punishment, power, and how far a society is willing to go when pushed to the edge. The gates still open at dawn, but once they close behind you, they never open again.